Michael Cassidy is the founder and president of the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. Just that name is very intimidating. Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. Boy, that's what we need. Now, under Michael's leadership, the Commonwealth Institute has grown from a little startup to one of Virginia's leading voices on state fiscal and economic policy issues. It is our go-to organization in Virginia on the John Fredericks Show because, like me, they truck the truth. Now, Michael has more than 2 decades of public policy experience, including past work as an analyst for the U.S. Office of Management and Budget and the Virginia Department of Planning and Budget. So he has a proverbial bird's eye view on government fiscal affairs. Michael, welcome to the program.
Good morning, John. Good to be with you.
It's good to have you with us. Now, I want to dive right into it. We got about 20 minutes, so let's get right to it. We're going to talk about health care and financial policy today, a little policy wonkery. Now, this is a complex area. In public discourse, we often hear issues such as Medicaid and Medicare and Obamacare oversimplified to sound bites. Sometimes I do that. But when we talk about health care on the show, I really try to give my audience the straight scoop, the straight talk. We don't want to go down the rabbit holes, but we also want people to be informed so that even when opinions aren't the same, we hope everyone has a better understanding of these topics. And as you know, Michael, from being a listener to my show, that's our signature. Now, here in Virginia, we've seen a couple headlines lately dealing with Medicaid cost and Medicaid expansion. And it's my job to get to the bottom of it and get to the truth. A state report recently, get this, suggested that Medicaid costs are up substantially over the last decade. Okay, we understand that. Some are arguing that those rising costs are a strong case against further expanding the Medicaid program to cover more people. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it's important for your listeners, John, to know that some of the key figures that have been publicly broadcast to advance an anti-Medicaid expansion agenda have certainly been presented without important context that can lead and create misleading impressions among the public. For example, there was a really informative article in the Daily Press just last week that fact-checked some of the claims about Medicaid costs being made by opponents and found them to be lacking and, in some cases, inaccurate. For instance, the article points out that Medicaid's actual state cost increase over 10 years is less than half of what has been publicly proclaimed once you take into account important things like inflation and population growth. And here's another thing that's really important. About $1 billion, that's billion with a B, in state Medicaid cost increases are due to decisions made by Republicans and Democrats in Virginia's General Assembly to add new people to the Medicaid rolls.
Right.
Many of those people added to the program are folks with very serious disabilities who need pretty hands-on medical treatment and attention. And here's why care for those folks is so costly. They tend to receive that care through a fee-for-service model, which, as the name implies, means billing for the quantity of services provided. The majority of Virginians in Medicaid are in what's called a managed care program. And so we've seen expansions of a very costly part of the program, and over years, by both Republicans and Democrats in the General Assembly. And, of course, the key issue on the table with Medicaid expansion is really talking about a totally different population.
So, Michael Cassidy, let's just get back to this a second. So what you're saying is that the General Assembly, Republican-controlled General Assembly, has passed legislation in order to expand the fee-for-service piece of Medicaid in Virginia, which are those that for extreme extended care for the elderly, for the blind, for the disabled, things like that. I mean, it's a good thing to do, right? Because if they can't take care of themselves, they need special care. But what you're saying is that's been driving the cost up. So let's go back a moment. You said that $1 billion of Medicaid growth over the past decade has been supported by state legislators in both parties. Are we onto something here?
Yeah, that's right, John. As you said, this is complicated stuff, and it's easy for folks to get confused. And because of that, it can be difficult for the public to recognize when, tall tales unfairly or inaccurately vilifying Medicaid are being spun. It might help to give your listeners a quick overview of how Medicaid actually works. It's a combined federal-state program where Washington and Richmond split the cost 50-50 for providing health care coverage to low-income folks. Similar arrangements exist in the other states, though many other states have a more generous split from the federal government in terms of that match rate, because in general, Virginia is a pretty wealthy state. Medicaid reimburses healthcare providers like hospitals or doctors for providing treatment to Medicaid enrollees, and there are very low reimbursement and payment rates for that, which means providers often have a tough time covering costs of treating those folks. Virginia has some of the most restrictive Medicaid eligibility requirements in the nation. For example, if you don't have children, we don't cover you at all, no matter how poor you are. We don't offer any coverage for childless adults. If you're a working mom with 2 kids, our coverage is also very low because the coverage basically caps off at just half the poverty rate.
Right.
And so we're talking about folks who are eking by financially. And the other important point I want to make to folks listening to your show is that we have about 1 million people enrolled in Medicaid and the Children's Health Program in Virginia, FAMOUS. The program enrollment growth has been fairly modest, less than 4% over the last few years. And here's the startling fact that's often overlooked. The folks on the fee-for-service side of the program, the ones that are often the most costly and intensive in terms of their medical needs, are a smaller share of the overall program enrollment, but they represent the majority of total program costs. Those are, as you mentioned, folks like the aged, blind, and disabled. They make up about 1/3 of the Medicaid population, but they account for 2/3 of the program cost. Conversely, low-income kids, pregnant moms, and adults in the rest of the program are 2/3 of enrollees, but they're just 1/3 of the cost. And that makes sense when you think about it, because folks who are consuming health care for routine things like a broken bone or an illness that can be treated with antibiotics, that's not really costly. They access health care when they need it, and then they go on with their lives. People like that, folks who are low-income working folks, are the ones that we're talking about when we discuss this whole issue of Medicaid expansion. That's the population that would be served if we went ahead and expanded coverage. Most of them are working. They're out working in the most important sectors of the economy. The bulk of them are in the tourism sector. Others are in the retail sector, construction, or other key parts of our economy. And so that's really the issue on the table for the question of going forward and expanding coverage are those kind of folks, not the ones in the program that have been driving the cost increases in recent years.
Well, look, we have to have an honest debate, and you got to get to the truth. And when you start mixing facts with opinion, that's when you get into trouble, and that's where I like to step in and straighten it out. We're with Michael Cassidy. He's the founder and president of the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. And so the deal is, Michael, that when you look at Medicaid, you got 2 segments here, and the number one segment driving the cost is not the people that would be affected under Medicaid expansion, if you will. It's the fee-for-service segment, which is the aged, the blind, and the disabled. This is the segment that the General Assembly said, hey, let's go ahead and cover these people, be sure they can get the care they need. They represent 1/3 of the base in Medicaid, 2/3 of the cost. This is the segment, which the General Assembly signed off on, bipartisan, Republicans included, that is driving the cost, not what you would think the traditional working people that need coverage. So I want to get into Medicaid expansion in just a moment, but look, everybody that tunes me in knows I don't like Obamacare. I've been highly critical of it, but I just have to say I find it fascinating to learn that not only are $1 billion in state Medicaid cost increases over a decade due to legislative choices by Republicans and Democrats, but those costs are largely concentrated in that side of the program serving, as I said, aged, blind, and disabled people, which it's a good thing that we're covering them. But when you turn to Medicaid expansion, Governor McAuliffe said last week that he's going to continue to push for Medicaid expansion. He's going to meet big opposition again with the Republicans in the state budget. Republicans saying they're going to oppose it, but the Republicans are saying that it's a budget buster. The party has also prevailed in the Medicaid fight in the past 3 sessions. So how do you even begin to change minds on the issue? And is McAuliffe just wasting time?
Well, I think it is important, and I'd like to point out that you could argue that adding more Medicaid beneficiaries on the more expensive side of the program is a form of Medicaid expansion that the Commonwealth has carried out for several years. And so I think part of how we move this issue forward, John, is for folks to be straightforward about the facts and what policy decisions lawmakers have made to date, what the option on the table under Medicaid expansion really represents. It represents a much less costly population to care for, and it represents extending health care to working folks, folks who are working in the most important sectors of our economy. The tourism, the retail trade, the construction trade, these are the most important sectors of our economy. And so when we think about the rhetoric we hear from politicians about how they want to build a strong economy, they want to build a strong economic future, having health care access for more working folks in the state, bolstering these key sectors of our economy, which we know are critical for success, needs to be a part of that. The benefits clearly outweigh the objections, I think, and I think there's ways to design an expansion of coverage that makes sense for Virginia. I mean, look at it. Hospital, healthcare, and related jobs, they account for 1 in 9 Virginia jobs. Those jobs are already helping to power our economy. The healthcare sector is one of the few job growth industries in Virginia these days. And healthcare jobs are projected to be a major economic engine nationally over the next 8 to 10 years. And so when we look at the numbers, you see that going forward with expansion, drawing down those federal dollars that are available to Virginia, it's estimated would support about 33,000 jobs, and they're good-paying jobs in the healthcare sector. And regardless of how folks feel about the Affordable Care Act, there's no dispute that its taxes on Virginia are already being paid. Mm-hmm. And the substantial cuts that are also part of the Affordable Care Act to health care funding for hospitals are already taking effect. Those parts of the Affordable Care Act are in place and on track. We're paying for this program either way. It only makes financial sense to access those available federal dollars that are sitting there so we can cover thousands of low-income working folks.
We're with Michael Cassidy. He's the founder and president of the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. Michael, though, the Republicans say, look, here's the problem. You make the argument that we can get these federal dollars, but eventually these federal dollars go away, and then Virginia's stuck holding the bag on the program having continued to expand, which obviously, regardless of how it's expanding, it's the number one growth segment in Virginia's budget, what our Republicans are saying. So they say, what happens after the federal money goes away?
So the federal dollars are going to cover no less than 90% of the cost. So that's the opportunity on the table. The feds have promised to pay 100% of the cost in 2014, 15, and 16. That starts to march down over the next several years to no less than 90% starting in 2020. I think it's a real red herring, to be honest with you, John. Over 20% of Virginia's budget is federal dollars. So if opponents of Medicaid expansion really believed that the federal government is going to renege on its promises and cannot sustain federal support for public programs, then they would also be dramatically restructuring our state's transportation program, our state's public safety program, and the whole host of other things where the federal government provides significant funding to support public investments here in Virginia. You know, I think it's interesting when we reflect back to the last few years in Washington and the fights we've had the fiscal cliff, the super committee, the debt ceiling, all these high-stakes budget negotiations, government shutdowns, and the like. We've had a series of agreements, sequestration chief among them, that have led to dramatic reductions in federal spending in both defense and non-defense spending. And you know what's gone untouched in all that? In all those high-stakes battles and those multiple laws that have been enacted on federal budget policies, the match rates on Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act have been untouched. So I would also argue that if there ever was a time when the feds were going to reshuffle the cards and what their promise was with regard to the generous match rates for Medicaid expansion, it would have been in these last several years when we've seen those high-stakes battles. But those have been untouched. And so I think lawmakers can confidently move forward, just like we depend on federal dollars for transportation investment and public safety investment, for depending on federal dollars to support expanding health care to more low-income working folks in our state.
Now, Michael, what about the argument that those people that fall through the gap, this is another one of the Republicans' argument, they make so that everybody understands Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion would be for those people that make too much money. They're working, right? They make too much money to be eligible for Medicaid now, but they're the working, lower middle class, working poor, what have you. Many of them listen to my show, by the way.
Sure.
But they make too much money to qualify for Medicaid. But then the Republicans say, well, look, that's what Obamacare is for, because then they can get the subsidy and get their insurance through Obamacare. Why doesn't that work?
Sure. So you're exactly right, John. They've fallen into this coverage gap. They make too much money for the current Medicaid program, which, as we talked a few minutes ago, is very strict in terms of its income requirements. But they don't make enough money to access the health insurance on the exchange through healthcare.gov. Those sliding scales of subsidies that are available through tax credits to folks to afford the coverage on the exchange are only available for folks who make over 100% of the poverty limit. So from 100 to 400% of the poverty limit on a sliding scale is available, those kinds of tax credits. And so like a working parent, like we're talking about, a low-income working mom with 2 kids, if she's making more than half the poverty limit but less than the 100% of the poverty limit, she's in this coverage gap. And you can see where that's a real problem. I mean, you can see just the everyday stuff of life can cause somebody to fall into that coverage gap. I mean, let's say someone's working and they're making more than the federal poverty limit, so they've got coverage in the exchange, they're doing a good job, everything is, they've got some affordable health care for them and their family, but then they end up having to take some time off work to take care of a sick kid or a sick parent. Their income drops, they're suddenly in the coverage gap. Those are the kinds of stuff that we want to avoid, and there's an option on the table for Virginia to expand coverage so that we have an array of options so that no matter what happens in everyday life, folks have a chance to get quality, affordable health care somewhere, either through our state's Medicaid plan or through buying coverage on the exchange.
Michael, do you know offhand what the federal poverty limit is now?
Well, so for a family of 3, we're talking about, for folks getting the Medicaid expansion, it's somebody making less than $27,000 a year. So it's fairly low. These are low-income folks. This isn't big money. They're scratching to get by. And to find that sort of support for quality, affordable health care, we think is really key.
So basically, if I'm a family of 3 and I'm making $30,000, I'm falling in that coverage gap.
Yeah, if you're making under that, you're in that gap, and that's the real challenge here. Because when we think about how folks who are earning that much, trying to support kids, putting food on the table, keeping the car repaired to get to work, trying to save a little money to send their kids to college, how do you afford health care if you're not getting it through your job?
You just can't do it. And if you can't get it through Obamacare, and I think you said that to get Medicaid, you had to be at 50% of the poverty level. So you would have to at a family of 3 would have to be making $13,500. I mean, there's no way you can buy health insurance with that. I mean, there's just no way. I mean, the math doesn't work. So that's why we're in this predicament. Look, we got to find an answer for this. There's no question. And Michael Cassidy, I really appreciate your coming on. We're going to continue to have this dialogue, conversation, if you will, now right through the new budgeting process through the 2017 General Assembly. I appreciate your insight. And when you really want to get to the truth, you go to Michael Cassidy. He's the founder and president of the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. Hey, Michael, thanks for being with us, man.
Thanks, John. Have a great day.